Hello and welcome back. This is Dr. Jordan again, and today I want us to get started on understanding the music of this Western European Baroque period. The Baroque period usually gets started according to scholars, in the year 1600 with the performance of the first opera and ends with the death of Bach in 1750. So this period basically sees a major kind of musical revolution. The music of the Baroque is very different from the music we've been listening to in the medieval and Renaissance periods. There's an explosion of instrumental music. There is the creation of this modern harmonic structure where we get functional harmony and chord progressions. There is a more homophonic texture, and the instruments and voices are put together in various ways. The composers compose idiomatically for instruments. That's what I mean by that is that they require you to have a violin to play a certain line, so that only a violin can play that. It's not just any old instrument that they want doing those instrumental lines. They require a specific instrument for a specific instrumental line. And that's very different from what went on in the past with instrumental music. If you're using instruments, they just play along with the singer, and you can use any old instrument you want. Not anymore. The Baroque period is into writing idiomatically for instruments and voices as well. Solo singers, solo instrumentalists. That is all a big part of Baroque music. So when we hear the concerto or when we hear opera, we're hearing solo singers and instrumentalists for the first time. That didn't happen during the Renaissance. It was all choral music and instrumental consorts, groups of instruments. So let's get started on this Baroque period. As we mentioned before, the impetus for the Baroque period is usually seen as the Council of Trent, where there were complaints about not being able to understand the words because of this dense polyphonic texture. So we get more homorhythmic texture going. And so we begin to see, especially in Venice, by the 1580s, composers like Giovanni Gabrieli using polychoral singing, writing for voices and instruments together, all in the context of the Roman Catholic service at St. Mark's. This structure you see here is obviously in Venice. It's the Santa Maria della Salute, which means St. Mary of Good Health. And it was built in the 1630s, and it's a great example of a Baroque styled cathedral. There are several of these in Venice. La Redentore is another one. But this one is truly a Baroque gem. And every time you see a picture of Venice, you often either see St. Mark's, which is a much older cathedral, or this wonderful Baroque church, Santa Maria della Salute. And you notice how ornate it is and how decorative it is. The Venetians basically pioneered these kinds of Baroque structures, and the Baroque is much more ornamented. Baroque painting, Baroque sculpture, Baroque in this action, right? These Baroque sculptures are action-oriented. They're pictures of sculpted figures doing something. The Bernini's David is a good example of that. You got that in your textbook. Take a look. It's Bernini's David is right in the action of hurling that stone at Goliath, right in the middle of that. So it's an action kind of a thing. Yeah, so Giovanni Gabrieli and basically is connected to the Baroque through his career at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. And there you see it. Um, that's it's actually this cathedral is actually a Byzantine structure. It has a lot of elements that you would see in Constantinople, which today is called Istanbul. And Hagia Sophia in Istanbul looks a little bit like St. Mark's. So it's a very much a Byzantine sort of cathedral. And it's very ornate. Um, and inside it's wonderful. There are these golden mosaics of Bible stories from the Old and New Testaments, and it's there that Gabrieli began writing for instruments with voices, and began writing for polychoral singing, and they still do that in the cathedral today. So it's a wonderful place to go to a church service. You don't have to be Catholic. You can go there and you can listen to, and a lot of the music you're going to listen to is going to be music from the Baroque that was written for performance in this cathedral. It's a glorious experience. I highly recommend it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of compare what's going on with the Baroque and what's going on before the Baroque period, where we have this on the right here that I'm just pulling this in. On the right, you've got Renaissance music and medieval music. This they use church modes still in the Renaissance, but they're moving it more towards a tonal system, a system where you have a T and a Do. Um, the Renaissance, of course, we've been listening to a lot of imitative polyphony in Renaissance music, whereas you get this much more homophonic kind of solo singer singing a kind of a recitative called monody, or you get a solo instrumentalist playing with an orchestra. So there's much more in terms of the use of soloists in the Baroque period. Of course, vocal ensembles, a cappella vocal ensembles with imitative polyphony proliferate in this Baroque period, or in the Renaissance period, excuse me. Whereas, right, all of a sudden there's contrast. The Baroque style is all about contrast. This word concertato in Italian just means contrasted. So we have different kinds of dialogues set up between different elements. So you've got a bass on the bottom, and the bass plays this melody. It's often called a figure bass, and above that you've got a soprano melody or an instrumental melody above that, and in between you've got these accompanying parts. So you have a dialogue set up between the lowest voice and the highest voice, and or you've got a dialogue set up in a concerto between a solo instrument and a group of instruments, or a concerto grosso. You've got a concertino, which is a small group of instruments, and a ripieno, which is a large group of instruments. So you got those two things going. So you've got these contrasts going on, and it's all called this. The whole thing is called concertato. It's about contrast, and you'll see the same kind of ideas in painting and sculpture and architecture as well. They're all into this idea of this against that, dark against light, you know, action against inaction. It goes on and on. So this is a very much part of this Baroque aesthetic. In the Renaissance, right, we've listened to masses and motets in the context of Renaissance sacred music. Yeah, well, in the Baroque, they invent the oratorio, the cantata. So there's the sacred cantata we get up north with the music of Bach, and the oratorio, which starts out in Italy and then ends up in England with Handel. We're going to hear examples of those things. So these are new sacred forms, and they involve instruments, soloists, and choirs. So there's this combination of this contrasted combination of instrumental music, instruments with soloists, instruments playing with a duet maybe of singers, or chorus with instruments accompanying. It goes on and on. So it's not just a cappella voice anymore. Um, so and with secular music, it's the same thing. Right? You get the leads, the chanson, the madrigal, all in the Renaissance. And again, it's a cappella vocal music. Whereas with the opera, it's solo singers and chorus and ensembles with orchestra. And again, we get a secular cantata, which is a small group of instruments with a solo singer. So again, lots of contrast there. And then blam, we get this huge explosion of instrumental music. During the Renaissance, the instruments are just kind of, I don't know, I guess the word is schlepped. They're just kind of schlepped in there. You can use any instrument to play any of the vocal lines if you want. If you don't, fine. Uh, you know, um, the consorts are groups of instruments, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And so you're writing for instruments the same way you would write for voices. So there's this non-idiomatic kind of outlook towards instrumental music. Not anymore. If you want to write a piece of music for instruments, say you want to write a sonata, it's going to be two violins and basso continuo. And you can't play it on anything other than those two violins. So it says violins, right? Sonata for violin and continuo. Sonata for oboe and continuo, on and on and on. They tell you what instruments need to be used, and they write idiomatically for those instruments so that you can't really play a violin part on a flute. You just don't do that because the composer is telling you, I don't want a flute here. I want a violin here. Concerto, right? That a concerto is a piece of music written specifically for a certain solo instrument with orchestra. And it's a dialogue between the solo instrument and the orchestra. The orchestra will often play the main melody called a ritornello, and these ritornelli are played, and they alternate with solo passages. And we're going to hear an example of that as we go through. Um, the suite, a dance suite, uh, these are very rhythmically active dances in various that basically exploit rhythmic motives. Like the Baroque is da da dee da da dee da 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 dee, and that's the Baroque. That's the dance. So you're doing something that relates to that rhythm as you're dancing, and so a dance suite will have a number of these dances in there: allemande, courant, sarabande, gigue, uh, minuet, bourrée. All of these dances are incorporated in this dance suite, and it's just a string of these dances going on. And that's obviously intended for some sort of social occasion where you want people to be dancing, duh. So yeah, and composers in the Baroque did a lot of composed a lot of these dance suites. Sometimes they're for orchestra, sometimes they're for a small group of instruments, sometimes they're just for a solo instrument. Bach composed a lot of these solo suites for cello and violin, and yeah, um, obviously the basis for a lot of Renaissance music is this cantus firmus. A cantus firmus is just a plain chant. And they take the plain chant and they use it in the context of a motet or a mass, and so you can hear the plain chant melody going on underneath these pieces that are polyphonic a cappella choral pieces. Whereas now it's freely composed. You're not going to hear plain chant melodies anymore. Um, they will employ a cantus firmus. Bach did that, but it's not plain chant. It's going to be an old German chorale from the Lutheran tradition. Music is during the Renaissance is primarily at court. These dukes and earls and kings and queens employ these musicians at court for secular music and in church. And again, the bishops and the archbishops and the cardinals and the pope employ musicians for use in sacred music. For the first time now, we get public theaters in the Baroque period. So there is this new kind of uh, uh, emphasis on public theater. And how do you get people into a public theater? Well, you've got to attract a crowd. spectacle. Lots of fantastic singing, but lots of machines, carting these singers around, flying them around on ropes and various other things, and hopefully they're going to be singing while they're doing this. Yeah, so there's all kinds of these, spectacular machines and theatrical devices that are used to create a public spectacle and attract a crowd. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But nevertheless, for the first time, we get these public theaters, and mainly the what's being presented in these public theaters is opera. Opera is the rage, and it starts in Italy and it explodes all across Western Europe. And so there are Italian opera houses in Germany and in Sweden, in Russia, St. Petersburg, in France, and of course in England. When we get to Handel, we'll talk about that. So opera is huge during this period, and it's still huge, especially in Germany. There you see a painting by El Greco. And you notice this is a painting that's designed to be looked up at from above. It's the nativity. It's a nativity scene with Mary and the baby Jesus and the shepherds adoring the baby Jesus, and angels up on top. And you notice again this idea of chiaroscuro. Um, chiaroscuro, chiaro is light, oscuro is dark, and El Greco employs this chiaroscuro technique where you have a dark background and the main protagonists in the painting are lit up by light here. So it's uh, it's a very popular painting technique in the Baroque, and you see it employed not by just by El Greco, but by Rembrandt and Caravaggio and Artemisia Gentileschi and others. It's a very prominent in 17th century painting. Um, there you see another El Greco. Uh, he lived in Spain and painted mainly for Spanish sacred art, and but he was actually originally from Greece, and the Spaniards couldn't pronounce his name, so they just called him El Greco, the Greek. There is Caravaggio. This is Doubting Thomas. And the thing you notice about Caravaggio, other than this chiaroscuro, you see a lot of this chiaroscuro technique here. But also, the thing you see about Caravaggio is the faces of the people in the painting. These are street people. Honest to God, he just brought people into his studio in Rome and painted these street people. And you notice this, Doubting Thomas, his tunic is torn. They literally look like they're homeless people from the streets. And virtually all of his paintings involve that kind of thing. They're Caravaggio was famous for indulging in street brawls. In fact, he he actually killed somebody in one of these brawls. You have to understand something. The paints that were being used by these painters contained a lot of heavy metals, lead and mercury. So to get the bright colors he wanted, they had to employ lead and mercury. And Caravaggio had a nasty habit of licking his brushes. So so he is literally being poisoned by his own paints. And the result is he's a little bit kind of on the wacky side. Mercury poisoning can make you crazy. And so Caravaggio is, seriously mentally inhibited by heavy metals. It eventually would kill him. He died very prematurely because of his ingesting all these heavy metals. Of course, they had no idea that it was poison, um, and it was used in makeup as well for women. Um, and so, mercury was also became used for treating things like stomach ailments and STDs. People would take mercury, and um, And it didn't work very well, but it's all they had. And look at this ornate sculpture, neoclassical, and this sculpture is basically gives you an idea of this fascination that they had during this period with ancient Greco-Roman antiquity. So this is Poseidon, the god of the sea, and there he is presiding over this pond. In this is in Florence in Boboli Gardens. Uh, and it's not too far from the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And for €10, you can go in there and walk through there. It's kind of neat. But yeah, and so and notice Poseidon is in the act of spearing a fish or something. Poseidon is active and he's doing something, and that's very typical of this period sculpture in this period. Again, you've got the David by Bernini, and you can see that there. You know, the Bernini was the sculptor used by the church. His sculptures are basically throughout St. Peter's and throughout the Vatican and in various other churches. The most interesting one, I think, is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which paints St. Teresa in ecstasy as she's getting closer and closer to God. And it's a fascinating sculpture. Um, I'm not sure we need to say much about politics and culture during this period. Uh, it's we see the beginnings of this imperial domination of Western Europe by other countries. You know, Spain started in the 16th century, and then everybody else gets in on the deal here in the 17th century. Obviously, England begins to expand its imperial ambitions, and it, you know, established colonies like Jamestown, and of course the New England colonies were established during this time. Um, France begins to explore and establish colonies in Canada, what is now Canada, in the St. Lawrence River Basin. So we see the beginnings of a challenge to Spanish supremacy across the world here. And Spain begins to decline while England begins to grow. Yeah, so that's all a part of it. The Dutch enjoyed a kind of a golden age. In fact, that's exactly what they called it. They called the 17th century in the Netherlands they call it the golden age. And of course, Rembrandt's paintings come out of this golden age. And there you see one of the great paintings that Rembrandt did. It's called The Night Watch. And it basically gives you a picture of one of these militias in Amsterdam. There are all these militia groups in Amsterdam. And that's another thing that got imported by the American colonies. You know, this militia idea starts out in Amsterdam, and then we get the Minutemen, you know, a century and a half later in Massachusetts. So yeah, you'd be surprised at all the stuff that Americans got from the Netherlands. And the Netherlands enjoys, they begin to rival the British and the French and the Spanish in terms of imperial acquisitions. And they establish sugar colonies in South America and in the Caribbean. They take over what is now Indonesia, and of course they colonized North America. So a lot of the words that that are like Harlem, for instance. Harlem's the name of a town in the Netherlands, but it's also a neighborhood in New York City. Why? Well, because the Dutch the Dutch founded New York City. They call it New Amsterdam. And it got changed later when the British took over to New York. There it is. So, yeah, this is in the painting's in the Rijksmuseum. And if you're ever in Amsterdam, visit the Rijksmuseum and take a look at this because it's truly spectacular to take your breath away. We see the emergence of the scientific method. Descartes was one of the pioneers with mathematics. And So, there's this new skepticism that comes to the fore, and people begin trying to understand how the world works. That started all the way back, of course, with Copernicus. Then Galileo was punished for basically confirming that Copernicus was right. And he was forced to recant his findings, but they're already published and people could test them. And yes, he was right. The Earth revolves around the sun. The sun does not revolve around the Earth. There you go. Um, Francis Bacon, again, living in this period in the early 17th century, uh, really is the one credited for inventing the scientific method. Proving your hypothesis, figuring out, what you want to prove, and then using an experiment and the data collected from that experiment to show whether it's true or not. Um, and so, uh, and so this knowledge basically gets started here. Our idea of how science works begins right here during the 17th century. Of course, here's a painting of Isaac Newton, great scientific genius. Newton, of course, postulated the laws of motion, and he created basically an understanding of how things work. Gravity, entropy. Um, Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Laws of motion. So Newton postulated a universe where everything functions according to certain laws, and he didn't really tell you why these laws worked. He just told you that they did work. Um, the old apple falling on his head, and he thought about, well, this must be gravity, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, so, yeah, um, this means that according to Newton, the universe is like an elaborate clock, and it's ticking away very nicely. And so Newton also founded a religion. The religion is called deism. And deism is basically this idea that God is the prime mover who created the world, but he created it, he set up these laws of motion, and the world is just ticking away. God doesn't intervene. So this is not a transcendent religion. It's a religion that really denies the possibility of miracles or any events that could happen that we can't explain. We eventually will be able to explain everything just according to these laws of the universe. So Newton is an important figure in religion. Oh, by the way, who John Adams, George Washington to an extent, and Thomas Jefferson were basically deists of one kind or another. Deism was very popular among elites in the 18th century. Another thing which influenced the creation of deism was conflict over religion. Um, the 30 Years' War broke out across Europe in 1618 and lasted until 1648. And it was one of the most destructive wars in the history of Western Europe. Um, and it was started over religion. So it was basically politics, power, and religion all combined to create this vicious, uh, horrific event. And so it was Protestants versus Catholics, and then it became French versus Swedes versus Germans, on and on and on. And it was a terrific war. And memory of that conflict played a real part in people beginning to question their religious values. And basically, they turned to things like deism as a result, especially among the elites. In England, of course, religion created a civil war. Uh, King Charles I was a kind of a Catholic, but he was secretly Catholic. He couldn't come right out and say it. And he got into conflicts with Parliament, and Parliament was dominated by Puritans. Puritans were English Calvinists that were very religious and very anti Catholic. And this thing broke out into civil war in the 1630s and 40s. And Oliver Cromwell, the general of the Protestant armies, emerged victorious over the king. They beheaded him, and Cromwell created something called the Commonwealth of England and ruled England for about 20 years. And this figures prominently in music, as we'll see when we get to Henry Purcell, because Purcell was around when they brought King Charles II back and restored the throne. So they call this the Restoration. And so we'll talk about Restoration England in the context of Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas. The patronage system kind of continues during the 17th century. So again, uh, all kinds of artists are working for dukes, earls, kings, queens, bishops, archbishops, etc. But we do have this injection of public theaters. So there's an option for an artist with the public theater. So you can write opera for the public theater, and you can make a little money that way. So it gives you an extra way to make a living. Plus, you can also teach. And a lot of composers and musicians made, made money teaching. They were able to basically increase their uh, financial, uh, you know, prosperity by teaching, along with composing and performing. So that's certainly a big thing. So how did this get started? Well, um, it all started in Florence with this group of humanist scholars. Uh, these there were several of these camerate. Camerata is just an organization, a club, if you will, of scholars who were trying to basically understand what was going on in Greco-Roman antiquity. And they're like blind men feeling an elephant. You know, they'll have one section that they'll be dealing with, and another group will be involved in some other issue. So they're just groups of humanist scholars. They're often wrong, but you know, of course they are. And the one that we're concerned with was called the Camerata de Bardi. This club was trying to figure out how Greek plays were performed. And if you've ever, been exposed to, Sophocles or some of the ancient Greek playwrights, you'll notice that there's always something called a chorus. Well, today, of course, chorus means a group of singers. That doesn't really mean, that's not really what the ancient Greeks meant by chorus. A chorus is kind of an outside observer who comments on the activity in the play. Um, and no one really knows how these choruses were performed in the context of the play. Was it a guy standing on stage? Was it a guy behind the scenes? Was it a group of people? We don't know because it never explains what's going on when the chorus starts talking. But being Italians and being Florentines, the Camerata de Bardi decided that the choruses were sung. Okay. And so they basically came up with rules for how to perform the chorus parts in the Greek plays. And they came up with this thing called the stile rappresentativo. And here are some of the rules that they came up with that you see there. The text must be clearly understood. Correct and natural declamation as they would be spoken. So, it's very different from the Renaissance. What you're doing is you're trying to get inside the meaning of the word and you're trying to pronounce it the way it should be pronounced and add an emotional impetus to the words so that you can really have the audience feel what the character on stage is feeling. And you interpret the feeling of the whole passage. So there's an overall kind of arc, emotional arc to every passage, and that's very different from what was going on in the Renaissance. So this this basically becomes operatic recitative eventually. It was at first it was called monody. The Camerata hired a couple of musicians to produce this thing that they called opera, which means just work. Uh, there were Giulio Caccini and Jacopo Peri. And so Peri and Caccini collaborated on the first opera, which was on the story of Orpheus. Uh, and Orpheus is a perfect subject for an opera because it's about a musician. Orpheus is a famous musician. He is well known and well respected as a musician. People love his music. He marries Eurydice, who is, beautiful and young and graceful and attractive. And so it looks like this is the dream couple, the famous musician married to the beautiful Eurydice. But things go wrong when Eurydice dies. Orpheus is utterly grief stricken. So he decides to go to the underworld to get Eurydice back. And he enters the underworld. He sings the Furies to sleep. He sings a song for Charon, the boatman, and Charon ferries him across the river Styx. He sings for the god of the underworld, Persephone, and Persephone says, okay, you're great. We understand it. You can have Eurydice back on one condition. As you leave the underworld, you can't look at her. Don't look back. She's going to follow you. Don't look at her. Well, she begins this trip, Eurydice following Orpheus out of the underworld. And pretty soon she starts nagging him, how come you're not looking at me? Don't I look nice anymore? And of course, the story goes Orpheus finally, out of frustration, turns to her, looks at her, and she disappears. And he meets a terrible death at the hands of the Furies at the gates of the underworld. So it's a sad story. It involves traditional Greek notions of hubris and nemesis, this sort of thing. But it's just this perfect story for an opera because it's about a famous musician. And so the first opera is on this subject. And it involves this new idea called monody. And Caccini was a master of it. In fact, he wrote an entire set of songs based on this idea called Le Nuove Musiche, the new music. And it was picked up by Monteverdi, who turned it into his seventh book of madrigals, this same sort of monodic style. And it's wonderful stuff. It really is. So this slide contains a picture of a woodcut. It's not a very good picture, but it gives you an idea about what a Baroque opera stage might have looked like during this period. You see the central character. You notice this individual is very tall, and he kind of dwarfs everyone else on stage. And we'll talk about why that is here in a minute. Um, but the sets are elaborate. There are, angels and heavenly creatures being flown around above. So it just gives you an idea of what the spectacle was like in these Baroque operas. Sometimes they even went as far as having naval battles on stage. They'd fill up the orchestra pit with water and, enact naval battles. So, and that was a big crowd pleaser. Anything to get a crowd. It's just theater, just the way theater is today. Without a lot of the technology that we use, but they did pretty well considering. Again, there's St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. You can sit under one of these umbrellas and buy a cup of espresso for 10 euros. And you got to do it at least once in your life. But it's just a glorious place to be, and that cathedral is really something. So it's a very interesting place, and this is where the Baroque was born. with polychoral singing, with instruments and voices being combined. And then with the advent of opera, there were as many as 23 opera theaters in Venice operating at the same time during the 17th and 18th centuries. So that's how popular opera was in this city. One of the things that really advances the cause of um, you know opera and soloists with instrumental accompaniment is these new harmonic structures, and these are structures that we've kind of touched on a little bit um, in the introductory session, the first module. For one thing, major minor tonality. Um, that is a huge advance. The old church modes were fine for Gregorian melodies. They didn't really work as well in organizing musical structures. And so composers in the Renaissance began to add sharps and flats as they saw fit in order to organize that T-do kind of relationship so we could organize musical phrases and ideas. And that developed into major minor tonality by the 17th century. The basso continuo is this bass line melody that is harmonized. So a figured bass is just the musical shorthand that was used. The figured bass, the bass line, the lowest part, is written out, and it's a melody in the bass. And so the bass has its melody, and the bass has little numbers, Arabic numerals that are written underneath the notes, and they tell you what notes to play above that bass line. So the keyboard player or the guitarist or the theorbo player, whatever, they would basically improvise chords above that bass note, and they would come up with a chord structure underneath that. And so this basso continuo would consist of a keyboard player or a guitarist or a theorbo player, some sort of plucked chordophone. You'd have that person playing the chords. Then you would have a bowed instrument like a cello or a string bass or a viola da gamba in the Baroque, sometimes even a bassoon, a wind instrument. They would play the notes of the bass melody, that figured bass melody. So you have that melody going on underneath, and then everything in between is kind of filler. And then above that line, you've got, you know, the singer or an instrumentalist playing the melody on top. So all of these things. The dominant seventh chord is a major discovery of the 17th century. And so we get that T-do being basically amplified by these dissonances in that dominant seventh chord to give us a more satisfying and more complete sort of cadential formula that can organize the music much more effectively, and also can change keys much more effectively. So you can employ that dominant seventh chord in various ways, and you can turn any chord that you're using into a dominant seventh chord rather easily by just modifying it chromatically, and you're off into a new key. But there are problems with temperament. uh, uh, by the 18th century, people realized that you couldn't just modulate to any old key because you needed to retune everything in order to do that. Well, Bach didn't want to do that, so he came up with this idea of an equal temperament. And so every note in the scale is slightly out of tune, but not so much that you'd notice. So when you're playing a keyboard instrument, you can all modulate from C to F sharp major without any problem because each of the notes is slightly out of tune in C major and slightly out of tune in F sharp major, but you you don't have to retune the piano in order to go from C to F sharp. Okay, so and that's how we tune in keyboard instruments today. Now, obviously, if you're playing the violin, it doesn't matter, because there are no frets on the violin. But it matters a great deal if you're playing the organ or the piano or a celeste. So those instruments are tuned according to with equal temperament. So one of the big things that you notice about Baroque music is the vigorous rhythm, especially Vivaldi. When we get to Vivaldi in the Four Seasons, La Primavera, we get that ritornello from the first movement of La Primavera is has that rhythmic activity. And it's because of those repeated notes. And they're usually separated. They're kind of staccato, and it gives that danceable kind of vigorous rhythm. But that's true of all Baroque music. It has this incredible rhythmic vitality, and of course, you know, you're, if you're listening at all to the what we heard in the Renaissance, uh, one of the one of the most least interesting features of Renaissance music is the rhythm. Um, the interesting feature is the melody that's imitated in all the voices, but it's not very rhythmically active music until you get to the end of the Baroque period with people like Pretorius who are composing this dance music. And so this vigorous rhythm is danceable, and it basically you start listening with your body instead of with your ears. Continuous melody. Uh, that's one of the great features of Baroque music too. The melody never stops; it just keeps going on. And you got a melody in the soprano part, in the highest voice part, and also a melody in the bass. You have these two melodies kind of going on at the same time. So it's both polyphonic and homophonic at the same time. Again, the dominant seventh chord and eventually the diminished seventh chord. Those are two great harmonic innovations that create this need for resolution, this conflict and resolution in Baroque music, and this idea of contrast between dissonance and consonance. And the diminished seventh chord is one of the great inventions of music history. Without it, you couldn't go to distant keys. It's an amazing chord, and one that didn't exist at all, as far as I know, in the Renaissance. In fact, in medieval ages, you could be burned at the stake for doing it. So don't do it. But terrace dynamics, they're sudden shifts in dynamics. We don't get as much of a gradual crescendo or decrescendo in Baroque music. What we get is we either get louder by adding more instruments and voices, or we get softer by taking away instruments and voices. That's how it worked during this period. So, the rise of the virtuoso. A virtuoso is someone who really knows how to sing well or play their instrument well. A person who has mastered technique, but not just technique, but musicality. Um, and so, and these it starts with opera, with the rise of the soloist. And as opera becomes more popular, we see more and more of these male sopranos and altos. And that's kind of the hardest thing in listening to Baroque opera. It's kind of hard to get your ear around the idea of a male soprano. And what happened was these poor guys were actually emasculated surgically at the age of 8 or 9. So their voices didn't change. They grew very large because the growth plates in their bones never froze. So they kept growing. This has been actually established anatomically. They actually exhumed the remains of one of these singers, a guy named Pacchierotti. And Pacchierotti was about 6 feet 4 inches tall. And he was still growing when he died. Okay. So I don't know why that is. A physician could tell you. I have no idea. But these people then, so they have this physiology of a man. They're big men, and especially during this period, when the average height of a male was 5 feet 6 inches tall, probably these guys tower above everybody. They're 6'3", 6'4", and they're still growing. And they have these big honking voices, but they're soprano voices. So they're ideal really for the opera stage because you can hear the guy You don't even need to sit down in the theater. You can hear them outside. and they're often very spectacular singers. Of course, we have no idea what they sounded like. There were no recordings, so they're verbal descriptions of them, uh, but we have no idea what they sounded like, and we're not willing to kind of try to recreate what they were doing for obvious reasons. So, the greatest of them all was a guy named Carlo Broschi. He and his brother wrote, uh, was a librettist. He wrote the words to the operas, and his brother sang them. And he went into the stage named Farinelli, um, and he toured Europe. He singing these operatic roles that were written especially for him. There were stories that he could sing for 3 minutes without taking a breath. So he's truly a magnificent singer, artist, and was just lionized across Europe. So this is the first kind of one of the first celebrity musicians, if you will. And there were many others. I mentioned Pacchierotti. Uh, there was also a guy named Senesino, a male alto, um, and it went on and on like that. And composers composed especially for people, for these castrati singers. Mozart wrote the Alleluia. The Mozart Alleluia was written for a male soprano. And so, as late as the late 18th century, we see composers writing specifically for certain male castrati singers. It went on and on. Very often, these singers would improvise. In fact, they'd be given a melody to learn, and they wouldn't sing the melody. They'd just sing whatever they wanted. Um, as long as it went along with the underlying chords, it was fine. So there's a fair amount of improvisation going on in opera. People didn't attend opera the way that we do today. You don't sit down in your seat and sit quietly and listen to the music. Um, People would attend the opera to make social connections. So they'd be milling around the opera house during the performance. And when their favorite singer showed up, they'd all of a sudden say, okay, let's sit down and listen to Farinelli or some other favorite singer. So, and there were female singers as well, and there were basses and tenors as well. But the overall, the biggest star in the opera, these were these castrati singers. The practice of castrating young boys ended in the 19th century, thank goodness. Um, in fact, the story goes that it was Napoleon who basically had a hand in it. A castrato named Crescentini sang for Napoleon, and the story goes that Napoleon was deeply moved by Mr. Crescentini's singing, and he asked Crescentini, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Crescentini said, "Do whatever you can to make sure there are no more castratos." And Napoleon did what he could. And so the practice kind of went out of fashion and out of use by around 1820 or so. But until then, we get these castrato singers. Yes, the affections. We touched on this before when we talked about Dowland, and this is an important thing as well. John Dowland was his lute songs concentrated on one emotion. And if you listen to Flow My Tears, obviously that's extreme sadness. So that's quite important. And that continues in the Baroque, where we get these Baroque uh, affections. There are, I think, 9 emotional states that composers exploited, and each separate piece of music, whether it's an opera aria or a cantata aria or an oratorio chorus or a movement from a concerto, they all concentrate on one emotion. So, and then if you have like a 4 movement sonata, the first movement is slow and kind of sad. Then the fast movement is happy and joyful and fast, and then you get a slow movement and another fast movement. and each concentrates on one emotional state. And that's all part of this 17th and early 18th century musical aesthetic. And speaking of women in Baroque music, we have a couple of examples. We're going to, Barbara Strozzi was a Venetian composer who composed mostly secular cantatas. And we'll talk about the Baroque cantata here in a minute. And so she's kind of an important figure in this idea uh, of women composers. There weren't a lot of women composers in the Baroque, but Barbara Strozzi is one. The other one, of course, that I can think of is Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, the French composer at the court of Louis XIV. We'll hear one of her sonatas. So it's quite a beautiful piece. So they're female performers too, performing especially in the operatic stage when they're not eclipsed by a male soprano or alto. They're there, and yeah, so women take an active part, and there are women instrumental performers as well. Vivaldi, of course, is famous for writing his concertos for this orphanage that consisted mainly of young women, and those concertos exist because Vivaldi is composing them for to play. Um, that was his job. So Baroque opera originates in Italy and conquers the entire Western European continent. The Italians had no military or economic influence, at least very little military or economic influence in the 18th century, but their musical influence is considerable. This is why that the terminology we use, allegro, presto, andante, spiccato, pizzicato. These terms that we use are all Italian terms, simply because Italy's opera conquered Western Europe. So by the mid 17th century, there were opera houses as far away as St. Petersburg in Russia, and of course there'll be two opera houses functioning in London by the 18th century. So this is quite a popular form of music, and it's really the first sort of democratic kind of form of music. Opera was open to everyone who could buy a ticket. So if you could afford the price of a ticket to the opera, you could go. Now you wouldn't sit in the same place as the upper classes, right? The best seats in the house were reserved for the aristocrats. But nevertheless, you could still go. You could interact with these people. So it was a great opportunity to develop these patron-client relationships that were really very important for people during this period. The aristocrats basically hired people. That's what they did their entire lives long. So they're responsible for employment of people who couldn't find work in any other way. And so the opera basically became a series of little musical numbers. And of course, today's Broadway shows are no different. The musical numbers in a Broadway show are separated by spoken dialogue. In the opera, the musical numbers are separated by recitative. Recitative is an ancestor of this monodic style that really was exploited by Giulio Caccini and then later Claudio Monteverdi. And we're going to hear an example of that with Orfeo. So very often an opera will begin with an overture, which is a piece just for the orchestra, written for the orchestra alone. And then the overture introduces the opera, and then we have a series of musical numbers separated by recitative that move along with the plot. Sometimes there are ensembles. More often in the Baroque period, there are arias. An aria is a piece for solo singer and orchestra accompaniment that usually expresses the feelings of the character as they basically are affected by the actions of the plot. And again, it's the affections that dominate, these 9 stock emotions that are portrayed in the music. Very often, a musician will write the music for the opera, but he'll use a libretto written by a poet. So there are all these poets that wrote these libretti, and they were set to music by these composers. So, and that's no different today, right? Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Lowe, on and on and on. You get a guy to write the words, and then a musical guy comes along and writes the music to the words. So, we have Mozart and Da Ponte, Metastasio, who was a librettist, who really, his words were said by a number of composers, including Mozart. So we get these librettists who write poetry, and they collaborate with composers. And so Baroque opera really is this incredibly powerful new medium that is exploited by composers all across Western Europe. And it's quite remarkable. Most of the time in Baroque opera, the subjects involve Greco-Roman antiquity or Greek myths. Sometimes a Greek play is an inspiration for the opera. And that's how it started with this Camerata dei Bardi, with this, this idea, well, what were the Greek playwrights doing? How was the chorus performed? These questions. And, they accidentally invented opera, which actually didn't have much to do with what the Greeks were doing, but hey, it's a new medium. So we're going to listen to a number of operas throughout the rest of the course, okay? So you have to really understand that opera is a creation of what we would call early modern Western Europe. And it's a type of musical theater, and it's no different in a lot of senses from musical theater today. In fact, today's musical theater has a lot more in common with Baroque opera than, say, operas from the late 19th century do. And so we'll examine those things as we go on. Opera might never have gotten off the ground if it hadn't been for Claudio Monteverdi. Monteverdi is this first great musical genius, and he was capable of writing both in this old Renaissance style that we've been exposed to and this new style. So, stile nuovo, they called it, the new style of music. And the new style is really this Baroque style, basso continuo, tonal harmony, this, chord progressions. Monteverdi is a genius in writing in this new style. And at the time the first opera was invented down in Florence, Monteverdi was working in Mantova. Mantova is just a little town about 150 miles maybe north of Florence, and they had a special occasion. He was working for the local duke, and the duke, I think, was marrying his daughter off to the King of France or something like that. So there's this huge, we need some real spectacular entertainment, and of course, Monteverdi had just the thing, this new thing called opera. He chose the same subject that Peri and Caccini had chosen earlier, the story of Ulysses, which is the perfect story, again, for opera. In fact, that story has been set some 40 or 50 times over the course of the history of opera. So don't, and it's probably still being considered today. So Monteverdi's Orfeo, which premiered in 1607, was such a masterful work that it caused opera to take off in popularity. And Monteverdi became so famous that he got the best job in Europe for a musician, the choir master at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. And he spent the rest of his career, after leaving Mantova, he spent the rest of his career in Venice composing sacred music, secular music, and operas. He went on to compose 3 genius works, Arianna, which we only have a few pages of that score, but we have the entire Coronation of Poppaea and the entire Return of Ulysses. And all of these operas are related to stories in Greek myths or Greco-Roman history. The Coronation of Poppaea is about a scheming woman who gets herself married to the Emperor Nero by literally murdering all of her rivals. Don't get the idea that Nero is a great guy to be married to, but at the time she thought it was a good idea. And of course, the Return of Ulysses is based on the Odyssey, the end of the Odyssey, where Ulysses comes back from his long sojourn, and his wife Penelope is being harassed by all these suitors who are after her money, and so these 2 are just real genius works that are still performed today. And we're going to hear a scene from Orfeo. This scene is really contains this recitative. Tu sei morta means, of course, you are dead. And Tu sei morta is about really it's this operatic monologue using this monodic style. And here we hear for the first time this sung imitation of speech. So it's very important because the singer really expresses the words the way that the character would have expressed them. Orfeo is consumed by grief in this scene because he just realized that Eurydice has died, and so his grief turns to first anger and then to resolution as he resolves to travel to the underworld and get her back. And so this is a very important scene, and it has a kind of an emotional arc to it as this extreme sadness turns to anger and then to determination. He is so determined to get her back, and he will go to the ends of the earth in order to find her and get her to return. And so there's a wonderful emotional arc to this, and it's all in this natural declamation, the way that the character would have spoken it. So Monteverdi uses his imagination here and puts himself in the place of Orpheus. And how would I say this if I were Orpheus? And so he has this, and of course that's the secret of opera, in essence. How would I say this if I were this character, whoever the character is? Cherubino, Mimi, Brunhilde, all of these people are basically kind of imagining, these composers and librettists are imagining these people, and they're putting their emotions into these people and trying to understand how they would react to any given situation where the plot is advancing through them. So that's the secret of opera, is because we can feel along with these characters. So right from the beginning, it has this instant appeal to an audience, and this is really important to know. So when we listen to opera from the Viennese classical period or the Romantic period, or even operas that are still being written today, it's really the same, and that's the secret of the appeal. So as you listen to Tu sei morta, you get a feel for how these words influence the music and how the words basically inspire the composer to create the music. And by the mid 17th century, the opera is this international phenomenon, but it's always in Italian everywhere. And when Louis XIV came to the throne of France in 1660, he wanted to create um, uniquely French art, uh, things that were actually French in nature. And so he wanted to create French opera. Now, the French language, if you've studied French, you'll understand that French is not spoken the same way Italian is. Italian's a sing-song language, whereas French is more spoken on a plane. Il m'a dit cette nuit, j'avais ta chevelure autour de mon cou, j'avais tes cheveux comme un collier noir autour de ma nuque et sur ma poitrine. I'm doing my best here to make it spoken on a plane, right? And at the end of the sentence, you go up. And so there's this kind of emphasis on the last couple of syllables of a sentence in French. And you don't, io son l'ancilla, so that's Italian, and it's more of a more of a sing-song language. And so to create uniquely French opera, Louis hired an Italian. Don't ask me why, but there he did. So there is Jean-Baptiste Lully, who created French opera, and again, the language determines a lot in terms of how the music is structured, and so it's structured in a way that is consistent with the French language, and so. Louis and Jean-Baptiste Lully and Molière, the librettist, create this uniquely French art. And of course, there are a lot of great French operas in this tradition. This French opera tradition continues, and we get operas by the 19th century. We get Carmen, we get the Pearl Fishers, we get Massenet, Manon, so this wonderful French opera tradition just continues, and it has a uniquely French quality. There is Louis XIV, the Sun King. He wasn't just interested in French opera. He was interested in French painting and French academic life and the preservation of the French language. There's still an institute for the preservation of the French language in Paris today. And their job is to take all of the foreign words, the non-French words out of the language and substitute French words. And they have a considerable battle on their hands right now. But yeah, that's they want to basically create a uniquely French culture, and that's what Louis wanted to do. He was on the throne of France for something like 50 some years, and so he had an enormous influence over the life of people in his country, and his influence continues right down to the present day. Because he gave us a uniquely French form of opera and entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. And also, of course, he commissioned a lot of composition other than opera. So especially towards the end of his reign, he basically commissioned, Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre to write all of this music that she wrote, and it's published, and we're going to hear, we're going to hear the music that Louis XIV heard while he was having lunch. Okay. He traveled with a herd of musicians around him. He had 27 violinists that followed him around wherever he went so that he could hear music all the time. So he's the first guy to really create background music. Of course, if you're a king, you could afford it. If you were some schlep from, just, some small town in France, you're not going to hear music every day like this. That, of course, is Versailles, the palace that Louis built just outside of Paris. You can tour it today. It's absolutely a fabulous, fabulous place. When they say Baroque splendor, Versailles is what they mean. It is really, truly breathtaking. And it's a place, there was a constant party going on in Versailles for about 100 years. And, in 1789, when they stormed the Bastille, they should have been singing "The Party's Over" because that's the party ended. But and boy howdy did it ever end. So yeah, and we'll talk about that because Beethoven and the French Revolution have this interesting relationship, especially when Napoleon rises to power. Uh, Napoleon and Beethoven uh, are have an interesting kind of relationship, and Napoleon really influences Beethoven in a lot of ways. Well, what about England? The 17th century was a time of political and economic turmoil in England. A lot of people left and came to guess where? The United States. It wasn't the United States at the time; it was colonies, but nevertheless, um, it spurred immigration. This political and economic turmoil. There was a civil war in the middle of the 17th century, and as I've said before, Cromwell, the leader of this Protestant uh, Puritan sect, won and became the Lord Protector of England. You should read Dictator when you talk about the Lord Protector, but um, he wasn't really much different from the kings. And, into his sojourn as Lord Protector, a lot of British realized that, and they say, well, if we're going to have a king, it might as well be a king. And when Cromwell died, uh, they basically invited the king to come back. Um, the Puritans were, do you realize the Puritans didn't celebrate Christmas? They took away Santa Claus. Now imagine doing that. No wonder they asked Charles II to come back. So no Christmas, no holidays. It was just kind of a lot of people got sick of it. And so, here they came back. They invited Charles II to come back, and you're thinking, oh, well, why is he talking about this? Because it has an effect on art and music in the late 17th century in England. It's called the Restoration. And Charles, when he came back to the throne in 1660, or thereabouts, he was determined to create another Elizabethan age. And he looked back to the reign of Elizabeth and he thought, I should be doing this. I should be encouraging artists, musicians, playwrights, poets, these creative people. We need another golden age, of that, like the one that Elizabeth presided over. And so if he encouraged the arts. Cromwell hadn't encouraged this at all. And so this is he basically tried to encourage people to create. And it worked to an extent. It wasn't near as glorious as the Elizabethan time. There were no giant playwrights like Shakespeare, but we do get some composers who were, you know, really fantastic. And of course, one of them is Henry Purcell, who you see right there. Purcell only lived to be about 35 or 36 years old, but he gave us a lot of wonderful music. And he composed music for the court of Charles II. These masks were basically sort of variety shows for aristocrats. that's that's what I could say. It's sort of like Ed Sullivan for aristocrats. You probably don't know who Ed Sullivan was, but nevertheless, look him up. And the Beatles performed on the Ed Sullivan Show, for instance, and we got the equivalent of that with these masks. It's entertainment for the court of Charles, and the courtiers basically sang and performed these pieces. And a lot of the music still survives from this, and it's fascinating stuff. Purcell also wrote some wonderful sacred music. And again, it's mid Baroque. It's a very mature Baroque style. And so, we've heard early Baroque here with the Monteverdi, and Purcell's Baroque music is a more mature Baroque style. And these conventions are pretty solidified by the time Purcell comes along. So we get a true basso continuo. We get a lot of functional harmony underneath that basso, realized by the basso continuo, endless melody, et cetera, et cetera. And Purcell gave us this wonderful operatic masterpiece. which is still performed a lot of places today. It's called Dido and Aeneas. Uh, this was commissioned by a finishing school for aristocratic young ladies. Uh, you went to in the 17th century, people who went to school generally were uh, wealthy people in the merchant class, or they were aristocrats, and you didn't study necessarily science and biology and the subjects that we study today. School for these young ladies began with studying Greek and Latin. So they would study Greek and Latin, and then they would read the great classics in the Greek and Latin languages, the plays of Sophocles, Thucydides. Don't read that in Greek. Read a translation because the Greek is impossible. But nevertheless, they're reading that. They're reading. they're reading Tacitus, Suetonius. They're reading Dias Cassio. They're reading these Roman historians in Latin. They're reading, right, Omnia Gallia Divisius and Tre Parte, right, the Julius Caesar's Gallic war commentaries. They're just, so they're very erudite people, but they're not educated the same way. I mean, how many of us study Greek and Latin at the beginning of none of us. So, and so these people know these classics, these Greco-Roman classics, often by heart. And that's where Dido and Aeneas comes in. This opera, it was commissioned by this finishing school for girls. The girls actually sang most of the parts except for the part of Aeneas, uh, and which is a male voice, so you're not going to sing that. But the girls sang the rest of this stuff, and and it was an opportunity to get inside the plot of Virgil's Aeneid. Uh, Now, these girls probably had that memorized, or at least they knew it very, very well. The Aeneid is an epic poem by Virgil praising the Emperor Augustus, and praising the Pax Romana that was initiated by Augustus. Great propaganda. But anyway, they knew this thing backwards and forwards. So Purcell teamed up with Nahum Tate, a librettist, and they came up with the story of Dido and Aeneas. And the story goes like this. Um, Dido and Aeneas are in Carthage. They're in love. Um, they want to get married, but a curse is put on Dido, and Aeneas abandons her to take off to found the city of Troy. And so she is left abandoned, and she dies of a broken heart. That's the story. So, but it's not much of a story, but it's great music, and it's loosely based on this epic poem because Aeneas is the direct ancestor of guess who? Augustus, and so it's an epic poem that happens also to curry favor with the emperor. You can't do worse than that. So So, in your listening guide, you have When I Am Laid in Earth. This is the final aria, the death scene of Dido, where she dies of a broken heart. And it's a wonderful example of a recitative and aria. So the recitative begins, thy hand, Belinda, darkness shades me. And, darkness is painted there with a little melisma. And so, and then once, once the recitative ends, you get a 4-bar ground bass that introduces the aria. And you hear it plucked on a theorbo in this version of it. You can use the harpsichord as well, or just strings. But it's a chromatically descending ground bass. Da dee, da dee, da dee, da dee, da dee. And that 4-bar bass pattern is repeated some 11 times throughout the rest of the aria. And Dido comes in and sings, When I am laid. I'm laid in earth, you know. So that's the tune that she sings over that ground bass. And the rest of the instruments basically harmonize that ground bass with these wonderful suspensions. A suspension is a dissonance that's resolved late. And so you can hear that dissonance carried over. And that really and so the whole effect of this, it's in triple meter. So it's da dee da dee da dee da. And so it sounds like your breathing is more it's more labored. I'm having a hard time getting my breath, and so Purcell is on intimate terms with people breathing their last. People in the 17th century, knew death very well. They were not shielded from it the way we are today, and uh, and you may not either be totally shielded from it, but most of us are. But so we have this death scene where Dido is breathing her last. Remember me, but forget my fate. And so we have this, and again, this one emotional, right, extreme sadness, this emotional state of Dido as she's dying of a broken heart. So we feel this thing. The ground bass is descending by half steps. It's going down, and so it helps to create this we're descending feeling. As we're descending into the pits of sadness and gloom. And so it's just a piece of pure genius. There's nothing new about this half step descending ground bass. Baroque composers employed this constantly as a device. And over that repeating ground bass pattern, you hear several variations of the harmonization of that. So it's just a wonderful example. Bach's B minor Mass, the Crucifixus, he was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, uses the same ground bass pattern, the descending chromatic scale. And then we get to Dazed and Confused, Led Zeppelin, yeah, descending chromatic scale. They, I don't know, maybe Jimmy Page was listening to Purcell. Uh, yeah, uh, so listen to this. See if you can hear the ground bass and what it's doing underneath that thing. The ground bass goes by different names in different countries. So in England, it's the ground bass, this repeating ostinato bass pattern. Uh, in France, it's called a chacun, and in Italy, it's called a passacaglia. Same idea, different names. So, of course, most of the composers we know of from the Baroque are composers who flourished in this late Baroque period, and they're the big three of the late Baroque. Handel, Vivaldi, and Bach. Both Handel and Bach, of course, were born in Germany. Uh, but that's where their lives kind of diverged. Bach never left the environs of Germany. He was at various places, Kürten, Weimar, and Leipzig in Germany. But he spent his entire life, uh, in Germany. Whereas Handel was an international figure. He left Halle, I believe, to go to Rome and study with the great Arcangelo Corelli. Um, and uh, and Corelli's students often ended up in London. Um, London was a flourishing sort of international mercantile capital by this point in the 18th century, and it attracted people from all over Europe to try to make a living. Now, not that that was easy. London, because it was a flourishing mercantile center, was also a very expensive place to live. It was like San Francisco, maybe today, or New York City. Yeah, you go there and you can, if you're lucky, you can make a living, but all your money is spent on the basic needs, food, clothing, and housing, because it's so expensive. Same way with London during this period. So Handel, went from Rome after finishing his studies with Corelli and ended up in London, and he started an Italian opera house. and he did very well. He he flourished. Unfortunately, the money he earned from his operas, uh, he pumped right back into the opera house. And so Handel composed a number, I don't know exactly how many, just a huge number of these Italian operas. They were sung in Italian. They featured these castrati singers as the big stars. Farinelli never did appear with Handel. He did appear in London, but he sang for Porpora, sort of the rival opera house in London. So there were dueling opera houses here, and they're trying to attract and audiences. But so Handel flourished, but he wasn't very good with money, and uh, and he went bankrupt eventually. So, but and these Baroque operas are wonderful. They contain these wonderful Handelian tunes, melodies. He was a fantastic opera composer. He knew the voice. He knew the conventions of Baroque music and how to basically get singers to inflect their voices to make these emotional statements. And uh, Today, the Handel's operas are difficult for us to listen to simply because it's just recitative, aria, recitative, aria, recitative, aria. There are no ensembles, nothing like that. But if you listen to uh, the tunes are fantastic. They really are. You'll end up humming the tunes. I can hum a lot of them today. I won't do it for you now. In the late 1730s, Handel's opera company went bankrupt. This isn't unusual for an opera company. They go bankrupt all the time. But so, but how do you make a living? Handel's still young. He's still vigorous, but he's got to keep the wolf from the door, literally. So what am I going to do? He turns to oratorio. What is an oratorio? Well, an oratorio is a sacred opera. All an oratorio is an opera without staging or sets or costumes or makeup that's performed um, uh, with an orchestra, chorus, soloists, and instead of talking about Julius Caesar or Agrippina or those sorts of subjects, which are classical antiquity subjects, what we have is sacred subjects. And so Handel turned to composing oratorios, and he wrote an oratorio called Saul about the story of Saul and David from the book of Samuel. He wrote Israel and Egypt, a story of the Exodus from the book of Exodus. Judas Maccabeus, which is from the Apocrypha, which is the story of the Maccabees and their revolt against the Syrians, and on and on. So he composed these oratorios, and all an oratorio is just an opera. So he basically took his opera composing skills, adapted it to the English language instead of Italian, and composed these operas, these oratorios. And of course, Handel is chiefly known today for his oratorios, especially, guess what? The Messiah. And we'll talk about the Messiah later on. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, on the other hand, stayed in Germany. He didn't leave Germany, and so we get this kind of German Baroque music from Bach. Although he's perfectly capable of writing in other styles. Um, so he grew up in Germany. He got a job at a court, I think, in Kürten and at a church in Weimar. And then in long around 1730, he became the court, the Kapellmeister, they called it, for the Thomaskirche in Leipzig in Germany, and spent the last 20 years of his life writing sacred music in Leipzig. Unlike Handel, Bach never really composed an opera. He was much more into composing, secular instrumental music, along with sacred choral music. So he's a wonderful composer of sacred choral music. He was deeply religious. Handel was certainly religious too, but Bach you know, began and ended all of his compositions with a prayer. And at the end of his composition, he would always write "Soli Deo Gloria," to God be the glory. And so you're going to hear, um, in fact, you hear that in his music, SDG, Soli Deo Gloria, in in um, Germany, S is E flat. So E flat D G, Soli Deo Gloria. A lot of Bach's music is based on that. And it sounds kind of like this da dee dum. Okay, E flat, D, G, da, dee, da. So if you hear that in Bach's music, somebody da, dee, da, you'll hear it backwards in various other configurations, but you hear that a lot in Bach's music. So even his music is a prayer. He was a Lutheran, so a lot of his music is written um, with respect to this Lutheran chorale tradition that Martin Luther started back in the 150 years or so before Bach came along, and very very Bach also came from a long line of composers. And if you look at the Grove's Dictionary of Music, there were 40 some entries in the Grove's Dictionary. Um, and and the longest one is Johann Sebastian. And then Bach's sons also were composers, CPE, WF. Um, they all have initial names, just like JS. And some of them were more popular during Bach's lifetime than he was, uh, especially CPE. CPE was a very fine composer in his own right. There you see on that photo a picture of the Thomaskirche in Leipzig. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, spent the last 20 years of his life composing music and directing the musical ensembles at this church. And there's a beautiful statue of Bach, the composer, outside the church. The church was in East Germany until the country was reunited in 1991. So it was kind of difficult to visit it, but today you can go visit the church, and a lot of choral ensembles, especially American choral ensembles touring, will give concerts in the church or even sing it during church services there. It's still a Lutheran church that's in operation. As I said before, Bach was a very devout Lutheran Christian. So he composed not only secular music like concertos and dance suites, but he also composed even more sacred music, music that was intended to be performed in church. And this cantata, number 140, is a work that he would have written for an Advent church service. Advent usually begins around Thanksgiving and it ends on Christmas Eve. And so it's a time to concentrate on the coming Messiah, and they often deal with the prophecies of the coming Messiah in the Christian tradition, and these sorts of things are read during the lectionaries, and you hear sermons based on this. Uh, as I said before, you didn't just go to church for a couple of hours in the morning on Sunday; you went all day. So it's an all-day service, and you're going to hear. You're going to basically go to Sunday school, and then you're going to do Bible study, and then you're going to listen to a long sermon, take communion, eat lunch. You packed a sack lunch, so you would eat lunch, and then in the afternoon you would listen to one of these cantatas. And the cantatas focus on the readings for that given Sunday. This is one of the 4 Sundays in the Advent season. So what we're going to hear here is Bach taking this tune that was written either by Luther or under the auspices of Martin Luther back in the early first half of the 16th century. Now we're 200 years later, and we're going to take that tune and we're going to use that tune and the words to the tune as a kind of a cantus firmus, as a foundational melody for the whole cantata. So the tune keeps coming back in different ways, and everybody knew the tune. Bach's parishioners were people who attended church every Sunday, so they'd sung this tune, maybe some of them for 20, 30, 40 years, however long. And the tune goes something like this. Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme. Papi, 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 pa, pa, pa. Pa, 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 pa. That's the tune. So what you're going to hear in this fourth movement of the Wachet auf is an instrumental ritornello. Ritornello just means a little return. Literally was what it means. But it's a tune that just keeps coming back in the orchestra. So what you're going to hear in the orchestra is ba-da-dee, ba-dee, ba-dee, ba-dum, be-da-bee, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-dee, ba-dee, ba-dum, ba-dee, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. So that's the tune. The orchestra keeps repeating that tune as we go through this, and above it, you're going to hear the tenors from the tenor section of this choir sing this German text, Zion hört die Wächter singen. And this is on page 76 and 77 of your textbook. And it's going to go like, Zion hört die Wächter singen, das Herz tut ihr vor Freuden springen. Die wachet und steht eilend auf. And so you're gonna listen to that for that, and again, the tune is basically AAB. So there's a Ihr Freund kommt mit vom Himmel prächtig. That section is just a repeat of the tune we just heard. Ihr Freund kommt vom Himmel prächtig. Von Gnaden stark, von Wahrheit mächtig. Ihr Licht wird hell, ihr Stern geht auf. Okay, so that's the tune. But then there's a B tune, right? So there's A, and B. Nun komm, du werte Kron, Herr Jesu Gottes Sohn, Hosianna. So that's a contrasting tune. So that's how all these chorale tunes are. They're all AAB, no matter what the tune. This tune, of course, is an Advent tune intended for the Advent season. So listen to this carefully several times. Don't just listen to it once, and listen to it while looking at this listening guide. You notice it tells you it's polyphonic. It's a tenor chorale. The genre is tenor chorale from a church cantata. It's right? The meter is in 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, even the context, 7 movements in this chorale. It's about 35 minutes of music total. This is about 5 minutes long at the most here. So listen to this. I can't play it here, but listen to this and make sure you can pick it out the next time you hear it. Okay, so let's move on. Also on page 77, you have the last movement, number 7. Now, it's the same tune, but in this case, the last movement is really for the entire congregation to stand up and sing together. So it's kind of, and again, look at the text. Glory be sung to you with tongues of men and angels, with harps and cymbals. And so this is like a kind of a fitting conclusion. This is the last verse of this multiple verse hymn. And again, it's the same tune, but it's the difference. The words are different. So it's going to be Gloria sei dir gesungen mit Menschen und mit englischen Zungen, mit Harfen und Zimbeln schon. Yeah, and again, the same tune is going to be repeated with different words. von 12 Perlen sind die Pforten, an deiner Stadt wir sind Konsorten, der Engel hoch deinen Thron. Then a different tune, kein Aug hat je gespürt, kein Ohr hat je gehört, solche Freude. So we have AAB again, only this time it's homorhythmic and homophonic. Uh, the voices all line up, rhythmically like in a hymn. So it's not polyphonic texture, it's going to be homophonic texture. And this is really where the hymn tradition began. So if you use a hymnal in church, you notice that all the hymns are like this. Um, Essentially, even Charles Wesley in England, he borrowed this tradition from the Lutheran chorale tradition, which came to him by way of the Count Zinzendorf and the Moravians. But that's another story. Nevertheless, so this is where our hymn tradition is born, right here in the early 18th century with the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Believe it or not, Bach was considered to be kind of an old composer. So his music was actually out of fashion by the time he died, and his sons were writing in a newer style. It's called Rococo style, and that style of music is kind of a precursor to what we hear with Mozart and Haydn later on in the course. So yeah, this Bach was considered to be an old fuddy-duddy sort of by the time he died. His music was really intended to be played mostly during a next church service or the next court occasion. He's writing just to satisfy the needs of his patrons in order to make a living. So he didn't consider it to be all that big a deal. It only became popular when his music was discovered a generation or so after he died. And all of a sudden, composers began noticing that this music was truly wonderful. So he was old Bach. And as I said, there you see the whole Bach family. He had 16 children, which wasn't unusual at all. His first wife died probably in childbirth, and he married again. And so his children were excellent composers in their own right. Carl Philipp Emanuel, Wilhelm Friedman, a number of others, and they're all talented musicians and fine composers. But the Bach family died out in 1809 when his youngest daughter, Anna Magdalena, died, as far as I know. As I said before, Georg Friedrich Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach were born about the same time, mid 1680s, and Bach was born 1685, Handel 1687, and they were not born too far from each other. They were born within 50 miles of each other. But that's, as I said before, that's where their careers kind of diverged. Handel became an international figure who eventually he studied in Rome, settled in England. Bach basically moved around in various areas of Germany and stayed in Germany for his entire career. So Handel's music is a little more international in scope, a more cosmopolitan kind of music, and opera. Handel turned to composing opera. Bach never composed an opera. The closest Bach got to opera were these sacred cantatas, and it's important to remember that. So Bach is writing church music, and it's he doesn't really enter the realm of opera. That's just not where his interest lies. Handel, of course, spoke fluent Italian, and this is important if you're going to write opera during this period because opera's in Italian. So it might seem strange, Handel moving to London, establishing an opera house and writing Italian opera, but that's precisely what he did. Um, And he was quite good at it, and it was quite popular. Handel's operas were well attended, well received until the 1730s. So for about 20 years, he wrote opera after opera after opera, and he could churn these things out like crazy. But in the 1730s, they began to ridicule opera. There's something called the Baker's Opera. You'll see it on the film about the birth of British music, and the it ridiculed Handelian opera so much to the point where people who attended Handel's operas laughed their heads off, just remembering what the Beggar's Opera was doing. So Handel's Opera House went bankrupt, and so fortunately for us, Handel turned to oratorio. What is an oratorio? Well, an oratorio is an opera without sets, without costumes, without staging. It's just orchestra, chorus, and soloists. So it's static. You don't have people wandering around stage dressed in elegant costumes, and they perform these things standing. So an oratory is just an opera without any of the trappings of opera, and it's based on a sacred story, a story from the Bible, maybe. Handel's oratorios are subjects like Israel and Egypt, which is the story of the Exodus from the book of Exodus. Judas Maccabeus, which is from the Old Testament Apocrypha. These sorts of stories. But of course, Handel's, you're not going to hear Judas Maccabeus that much, nor will you hear Israel and Egypt that much. They're both wonderful oratorios, but the one you're going to hear all the time is the Messiah. Well, what is the Messiah? The Messiah is not a story. Like Israel and Egypt is a story. It's the story of the Exodus. Judas Maccabeus is a story. It's the story of a revolt led against a Syrian dictator by the Jewish people, led by a guy named, of course, Judas Maccabeus. So these are stories. They're more dramatic. Samson, Handel's Samson is about Samson and the Philistines, and Samson lamenting his blindness. So, yeah, this is a story. The Messiah, though, is more theological in its scope. The Messiah deals with Christian theological traditions, especially Protestant ones. So this is why you always hear the Messiah performed in church if you hear it performed, simply because it's about Christianity, and it's such a wonderful setting of these texts from the Bible that every time you hear Hallelujah, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth, at least I hear the Hallelujah chorus, even that's a text from the Revelation. John of Patmos wrote it back around 90 AD, and Handel set it to music in 1742, and they are forever linked. So the first part is the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah. A lot of the texts are drawn from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, and then the birth of the Messiah. And then the second part is the crucifixion of the Messiah, Jesus dying for sin on the cross. And the third part is the resurrection and the enthronement of the Messiah. And so, it's like a Christian meditation. Handel wrote it, composed it in a flurry, literally a flurry of inspiration. It took him about 30 days to compose this thing. So it's quite a work. The first thing you hear in the Messiah is an overture, an instrumental piece that introduces um, the work, and it's a French overture. The French overture was designed as a piece of propaganda by the French composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, and it begins with a very stately dotted rhythm. In the overture, it goes ba da ba dee ba da dee ba dee ba da ba dee ba da. and it was for the arrival of King Louis XIV. Okay, this is very stately, lots of pomp. The king is coming, and so. But of course, in this Messiah, in the Messiah, it's not an earthly king at all. It's the heavenly king who's showing up. So he's turned this kind of political propaganda into like a prayer. And then the second half of the French overture is usually like a polyphonic piece, a fugue. And in the Messiah, it goes something like this: dun dun da da dun 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 bum bum bum. And that little tune is imitated in these instruments as you go through this thing, and it's a celebratory kind of a feel there with this very fast, um, fugal kind of a thing. So you get this celebration of the arrival of the king, and so we have that sort of thing as also a prayer of thanksgiving for the presence of the king. Then the very next thing you hear is this recitative, "Comfort ye," and you have a copy of it in your listening guide on page 85. This is from chapter 40 of the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, and it's accompanied recitative. We heard earlier the recitative and aria from Dido and Aeneas, and this recitative tradition continues. In the Dido example, it's secco, dry recitative, just the continual accompanies Dido's lament before she launches into this aria. Here we have accompanied, recitativo accompagnato, accompanied recitative. The orchestra accompanies this recitative of the tenor, but it's still a declamatory style. He's basically talking to us, but singing at the same time, and it's a text written by Isaiah um, to comfort the children of Israel who were in exile in Babylon at the time this was written. So comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Uh, speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. This passage, of course, is quoted in the Gospels. It's put in the mouth of John the Baptist, who's saying this. So Christians have always understood this text as a prophetic text uh, announcing the coming Messiah. And so this comfort ye is the first part of this thing. Then on page 86, you get the aria, every valley. The aria, again, is introduced by a long ritornello. And then the tenor sings, every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill made low, the crooked straight, the rough places plain. Um, and uh, and that's all. Those are just the aria usually just sets a few words, but the words are painted. So we have a lot of word painting in this text. So listen for the word painting. When he sings crooked, the melody sounds crooked. The rough place is plain, the melody sounds plain. So you're going to hear word painting and a lot of melismas because these arias contain a huge number of melismas. So as you listen to every valley, the aria, this aria follows immediately after the recitative. So there's a big cadence at the end of the recitative, and then the orchestra launches into this ritornello, which comes back, and the tenor sings this aria. Listen for melismas. Listen for word painting. The more you hear it, the more word painting you can hear, and the more you can appreciate just the artistry of this great composer. Because Handel is deep into the words and the meaning of the words. Um, it's still this old stile representativo, representative style that Monteverdi and Caccini were so interested in. We still get that here in this Handelian oratorio. So this oratorio aria it's really important to understand how inspired Handel was in his setting of this text. And speaking of inspired text setting, this Hallelujah chorus is one of the most inspiring pieces of music ever written. Um, and if this doesn't inspire you, then man, I don't know what will. It's a setting of a praise text, a doxology, in other words, from the Revelation. This is the last book of the New Testament, and it was written by somebody named John of Patmos around 90 AD or so, according to most scholars of the New Testament. And it's again, it has all kinds of scary imagery in it, and it's been interpreted in various ways over the centuries. John might have been amused by some of the interpretations, but nevertheless, it has these doxologies, and the John's vision includes elders surrounding the throne in heaven, all praising God and Jesus, the crucified Messiah, uh, who he calls the Lamb. And so um, here in the Hallelujah chorus, we get this wonderful text. Hallelujah, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. The kingdom of this world is become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. King of kings, Lord of lords, forever and ever. Hallelujah, hallelujah. And just the setting of that word hallelujah, I mean, there's just no better setting rhythmically of this little motive. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Just it's so rhythmically active, and and it keeps coming back throughout this text. It accompanies itself. He pulls out all the stops here. He uses even at one point where he goes to monophonic texture briefly, but then it's polyphonic, it's homophonic, and for the first time in this, at the end of part 2 here of the Messiah, you've been sitting there for about an hour and a half by this time, and the trumpets come out. So this is the first time you hear trumpets. So think about that. All of a sudden, that brilliant brassy sound, accompanying this and timpani big time. So we get trumpets, timpani, strings, woodwinds, and so you get this really much fuller sound, but a much brighter sound that accompanies the Hallelujah chorus. The story is that King George II was so inspired by this piece that he stood. And in England at the time, well, actually, even today, okay, when the king stands or when the queen stands today, you stand. So everyone stood. And the tradition evermore has been you must stand when the Hallelujah chorus is played. That's why I have you stand. So remember that. Um, and so as again, the listening guide for this is on page 87, and it gives you all the information you need to enjoy this piece, like you really need any. Um, so so listen to it carefully numerous times. You should be able to recognize it if you hear it again. The Passion is somewhat similar to an oratorio, but the Passion, that word passion, literally is used in a very specific sense to mean the final chapters in the gospel stories. Doesn't matter which of the 4 gospels. The Passion is basically the Passion relates the events that began on Palm Sunday. And so when you commemorate the Jesus arriving in Jerusalem and his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection, you always start on Palm Sunday with his arrival. And so the Passion is a setting of these texts from the 4 Gospels, and it can be one or another of these texts. So you'll have, for instance, Bach set the Passion according to St. Matthew. So if you go to the final chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, you will see that text there, and Bach set that text along with kind of choral kind of interspersions and various other things um, in his Passion according to St. Matthew. And these things are performed a lot during Holy Week, of course. Also, he set the Passion according to St. John. So we have the St. John Passion as well. It's not done as often as the St. Matthew Passion. But these passions were done, especially in Germany, but gosh, evangelical churches do them today. They may not be the Bach version, but John W. Peterson used to set those things. And so, yeah, they may still do that stuff. And he's not done much anymore. Okay, so I like Boboli Gardens. There it is. Now we're going to discuss Baroque instrumental music. The Baroque sees an explosion of instrumental music. Most of this instrumental music is secular in nature, but it's still just glorious stuff. But it's the aesthetics are different from the aesthetics involving surrounding today's instrumental music. There's not much instrumental music out there. Most of the secular music you hear today are songs sung by a lead singer accompanied by instrumentalists. Here with the Baroque period, we see lots and lots of instrumental music. Part of that is generated just by technology. Instrumental technology improves to the point where these instruments can stand alone and they don't have to necessarily play vocal lines. So we see, there you see that picture, which is a picture of a viola da gamba. Um, Gamba means leg in Italian. So this is kind of like a smaller version of a cello, maybe, but it has what, 6 strings instead of 4. So there's some major difference. It's fretted. A cello is not. So there's some differences there. But you're going to hear an example of a viola da gamba being played when we listen to that sonata movement by Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. So one of the major instruments is also the organ. Organs were used throughout the Renaissance, but they become really grand and large during this Baroque period. So the Baroque organ is a very important instrument. We'll have examples of that. Of course, the harpsichord and the clavichord are, the harpsichord is a plucked keyboard instrument, and we'll hear some of that going on. The oboe and the flute are made of wood primarily. They have holes and not keys the way modern woodwinds are. Trumpets and French horns do not have valves, so they're played differently than a modern trumpet would be. They still have trombones, but they don't write much for trombone. It's it's a pretty loud instrument. So the emphasis on the Baroque are these stringed instruments. And the viola da gamba is a good example of just one type of stringed instrument. As I said, instrumental technology comes to the fore here. And in the small town of Cremona in northern Italy, Cremona isn't too far from Milan. I visited there a few years ago, and there's a wonderful museum, a musical instrument museum in Cremona. And these musical instruments aren't just in cases. People take them out and play them regularly because a violin looks like a violin, looks like a violin. It's the sound of the violin that you're after. So when we take out a violin by one of these great violin makers, Stradivari, Guarnieri, Amati, these Italian families had workshops, bodegas, in Cremona, and they made these instruments. To get the wood for the instruments, they went up to the Alps and to this tree farm. It's a forest. They called it La Bosca che Suona, the forest that sings. And they chose the wood from these spruce trees up there in the Alps, brought the wood down and fashioned it into these wonderful violins, cellos, violas, viole da gambe, guitars. There's Stradivari guitars. These stringed instruments, and they're still prized for the sound. So that you know, well, they're outrageously expensive today because there are only about maybe 60 Stradivari violins in the world. I don't know how many Guarnieri there are, but they're incredibly expensive. And certainly, you can buy a good violin made by a guy making a violin today. They're called luthiers, but you still Stradivari and Guarnieri are prized. These instruments are the finest that you can find. And so if you hear a really good violinist playing a really good professional violinist, a lot of times what you're going to hear is one of these Stradivari, Guarnieri. Yeah. And there is one of the finest violinists around today, Anna Kiko Myers, and she is holding her Guarnieri in her left hand. That violin is worth $16 million. As much as she plays and as much money as she makes, she could never afford $16 million. Foundations buy these violins, they bid on them in auctions, and they often end up being leased to these violinists. Sometimes they're handed down from one violinist to another, to another, to another. Paganini's violin was a Stradivari, and he nicknamed it Il Diablo. And Isaac Stern got a hold of Il Diablo and played it, and he willed it in his will to Midori, the Japanese violinist who plays it today, as far as I know. So Perlman has both a Strad and a Guarnieri. I don't know how he chooses which one to play on any given day, but he's got two, and it's unusual. Usually, you can just have one, and one's enough. There you see the plucked keyboard instrument, the harpsichord. The piano was invented in 1709, but it was not widely used. I think one composer wrote for the piano, and Scarlatti, but it wasn't widely used because it didn't have damper pedal. After 1750, this damper pedal was invented, and it allowed the piano to have better sustaining ability, and so it became much more popular after 1750. So you don't see composers writing for piano very much until 1750, when all of a sudden you see Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven writing lots of piano music. So when we deal with instrumental music, we basically are dealing with music by the big three Baroque composers: Vivaldi, Johann Sebastian Bach, and Georg Friedrich Handel. And all of these composers wrote something called a fugue. Bach is still acknowledged today as the great master of the fugue. And you have got a listening guide to the fugue on, let's see, here it is, page 92 in your textbook. And it takes you through this little fugue in G minor. And and the terminology around the fugue is just what you see there on the page. The main tune of the fugue is the subject, and the subject is imitated in however many voices there are in the fugue. Usually it's 3 or 4 voices. So you'll have a 3-voice fugue or a 4-voice fugue, and the subject starts out just by itself. So in the little fugue in G minor, you hear that's the tune, and you just hear the tune by itself. Then the subject is answered, usually a 4th lower or a 5th higher, depending on which fugue you're listening to. So when the subject is answered, there is a counter subject that plays along with it. So it becomes polyphonic at that point. It starts kind of monophonic for 3 or 4 bars. Then we get 2 melodies going on at the same time, and then the subject is answered a second time with 2 voices going. So we get 3 melodies, And if it's a four-voice subject, we hear a fourth kind of entry of the subject with three other melodies. So we get four melodies going on at the same time. And when that subject has been answered in all voices of the fugue, then we get what's called an episode. An episode is a period of time during which there's no subject material being played. And so you hear that. So, yeah. So, and then we get a development of the fugue. Um, After that first episode comes in, then we hear basic different kinds of treatments of the subject. If it's in a minor key, we might hear the subject in a major key. We might hear stretto, where the subject accompanies itself. So there are various ways of treating the subject during the development of the fugue. Then at the very end, the uh, the subject comes in again in the original key if it's G minor, the way this little fugue is. So we hear the subject stated in G minor, usually over pedal, a droning note. They call it a pedal tone because if you're playing the organ, you hold that droning pedal tone down with the pedal. You play the organ with your whole body, feet and hands. So you push down the pedal tone in the key of G minor. The pedal tone's probably going to be a D, believe it or not. It's usually the dominant note. So you hear D, and then you get a final resolution in G minor, and you'll hear that. So those are kind of the aspects of the fugue that we're dealing with. So this listening guide's on page 92 and 93. So refer to this and listen to this little fugue in G minor. That is Bach's organ right there. You might have heard him play this fugue if you had been around there while he was the Kapellmeister at the Thomaskirche. Um, but this little fugue in G minor has all this basic elements of a fugue, and you'll notice that it takes you through this with timings. So at 18 seconds, we hear the subject answered in the lower voice, and right, um, and then it comes in again at 41 seconds and at 58 seconds. Then you get an episode, and you won't hear the subject. Then at minute and 25, you begin the development of the fugue, and you hear the tenor voice begins with the subject, and then an episode, alto voice, episode, bass voice. This is all done on the organ. You're not going to hear voices, although you can have fugues for voices. Bach wrote a whole bunch of them. The Kyrie from the B minor Mass is right. Two master monster fugues, just setting Kyrie eleison. uh, so, um, and then the final statement comes in the lower voice over a pedal tone at 340. So you'll see that. So Baroque orchestral music. Um, these instrumental ensembles vary widely. There's no set sort of instrumentation for an orchestra. So, and mainly it's strings with basso continuo. And so, although you can hear other music as well, but orchestral music centers on this idea of um, contrast, concertato they call it. And so you hear very often you'll hear a soloist with an orchestra behind them, and that's we call that the concerto. Sometimes you hear a suite, a group of dances for orchestra. Although you can also hear a suite, and it's a suite for a single instrument. Bach wrote several of these. So the Baroque orchestra, we see the formation of this orchestral ensemble, and it varies widely depending on the composer and the needs of the composer. But there is this emphasis on orchestral music here. And we're going to start with the concerto. We're going to skip a few pages in your textbook and go over to the Baroque concerti. There are two kinds of concertos in the Baroque period. The solo concerto, which involves a soloist and a group of and an orchestra. So there's a dialogue between a soloist and an orchestra. Now the soloist can be playing any kind of instrument: oboe, bassoon, uh, recorder. It goes on mandolin. There's a mandolin concerto, wonderful concerto by Vivaldi for mandolin. And the orchestra gets a ritornello. So it's in this, we call it ritornello form. So the orchestra gets this tune, and the tune is played by the orchestra. When the orchestra is done with the tune, then the soloist comes in and plays contrasting ideas, and they hear this alternating between the orchestra playing this ritornello and the soloist playing these alternate ideas. The other kind of concerto is concerto grosso, the great concerto. And the great concerto is a small instrumental ensemble in dialogue in contrast with a large instrumental ensemble. So the small ensemble is called the concertino. It's a small group of instruments, sometimes violin, flute, and harpsichord. You can hear that with the Brandenburg Concerto number 5, I think, that we're going to listen to. And then the ripieno is the orchestra, the large group of instruments, and they will often play a ritornello passage that is basically in conversation with this concertino. The Brandenburg concertos are a really good example of concerti grossi. Handel also composed concerti grossi. Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, these composers all wrote these concerto grossos, and we're going to hear an example of that as well as we go through. But the great master of the concerto was Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi was a priest who lived in Venice, and while he was in Venice, it was his job to write music to teach these young girls how to play their instruments. He worked at an orphanage, and many of these young girls were the illegitimate children of aristocrats who needed a home. So the aristocrats would take their children that were inconvenient and they would drop them off at these ospedali, they were called in Italian. And so this, I think this was called the Ospedale della Pietà, the House of Mercy, literally. And this is where it was an orphanage for these girls, and Vivaldi was their music teacher. And so a lot of these girls got pretty good at playing instruments, so he arranged to compose these concertos for them. He composed some 400 concertos, and he was well known as a great composer of concertos. He would give the concertos were fundraisers for the orphanage. So they would have these concerts, the kids would play, and people would give money. So this was a fundraising deal, and they were quite well known and well respected as musicians in Venice during the first half of the 18th century. Vivaldi also wrote some sacred music. He wrote some operas. Many of his operas have been revived today, so you can hear them. They're Baroque operas. Yeah. So they don't really, they're not really that interesting. Really, his concerti are the thing that people relate to. And of course, the most popular concerti written by Vivaldi are these 4 concertos called the 4 seasons. Yes, the winter, spring, summer, and fall. Okay, and you have a detailed listening guide on the spring concerto, right? La Primavera. If you speak Spanish, it's the same, isn't it? And this is a typical concerto. It has 3 movements. So, and they're contrasting movements. The first movement is fast, cheerful in a lot of ways. The second movement is slow, maybe a little more doleful. And the third movement is, again, returns to fast, cheerful. Although the third movement in La Primavera is fast triple meter, the first movement is duple meter. So we get these contrasting ideas going through this. So it's all about contrast. and they're program concertos. What does that mean? They tell the story. Well, and the story, of course, is the story of spring. And there's a little poem that goes along with it. If you look here on page 104, it talks about the poem. Spring has come, and birds greet it with happy songs. At the same time, the streams run softly, murmuring to the breathing of the gentle breezes. Then there's a thunderstorm that comes in briefly, and then the birds return again. So what we're going to hear is this ritornello. That tune will run through your head. Trust me, it's a real fantastic tune. And it has that rhythmic energy with those repeated notes. It sounds like a kid would be interested in playing it, which is who's writing it for. So yeah, we have that. So I have that ritornello, and then the solo instruments come in and play bird calls. Then the ritornello comes back. Solo instruments, play again. It sounds like a running stream, murmuring brook. Then the ritornello comes back. Then the thunderstorm begins, and the rain and hail start. And then the ritornello comes back, and then the birds come out again. So there's the plan. And on page 105, it takes you through this one section at a time. And that's on your listening examples too. So you need to listen to that. Then the second movement, listen, here in a pleasant flowery meadow, the leaves sweetly rustle, the goatherd sleeps, his faithful dog at his side. So, back to the first movement though. So the ritornello, then, right, the solo passages, the birds singing. The first movement continues with the ritornello again. That's Botticelli, his painting La Primavera. Then the storm hits briefly. Then it clears up and the birds come back. So there you have the plan for the first movement of La Primavera. The second movement is a slow movement. It's in a slow triple meter. And the violas come in repeatedly. There's this wonderful tune but in the solo violin that plays a long, sort of lamentable tune in a minor key. And but the violas have this barking dog sound. It keeps coming back. It sounds like the dog barking, right? So the faithful dog is not sleeping very well. I guess the dog is vigilant while the shepherd sleeps, and so we have this barking dog in the second movement. It's kind of cute. Then the third movement comes in, and the third movement features nymphs and shepherds dancing to the festive sound of the pastoral musette under the bright sky. So these are happily dancing nymphs and shepherds, and the listening guide is on page 107. And again, it's an alternating ritornello solo, just like the first movement. So listen to this and enjoy it. The Four Seasons is performed all the time. If you go to Venice, everywhere you go in the summer in Venice, there's a concert of the Four Seasons. And they charge you a little bit of money to walk in and listen to the Four Seasons. And usually it's pretty well done. So people are making a buck playing the Four Seasons today, especially in Venice, because obviously Vivaldi he wasn't the only good composer to write music in Venice, but his music has become incredibly famous, and for good reason. It's really listenable. Our Concerto Grosso is the Brandenburg number 5. There you see the Margrave of Brandenburg. The Margrave was sort of like I don't know, it would be kind of like a federal judge, I guess. He's a magistrate who presides over various sorts of things. And he was in Brandenburg, which is in the state of Prussia in what is now Germany. And Bach tried to curry favor with the Margrave by writing these concerti for him. So he composed 5 concerto grossos, or no, 6, I'm sorry, 6 concerto grossos for the Margrave of Brandenburg, hoping to get a job, a commission composing more. The Margrave, well, he didn't listen to any of them, I think. He put them in his library, and they stayed there for God knows how long. But at some point, they were discovered, after the deaths of both Bach and this Margrave, and people started playing them, and now they're renowned as some of the greatest compositions in all of music history. So you have a listening guide to the Brandenburg Concerto Number 5 on page 102 and 103. Notice they are in 3 sections. So there are 3 tracks, 22, 23, and 24. And again, what we have here is a concertino and a ripieno. The ripieno plays this ritornello theme. And so you have that ritornello theme, and then you hear the concertino coming in with contrasting material, and it gives you timings for all of this here as you go through the movement. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long, and you notice as you get through this, part 1 involves the orchestra, the ripieno, playing this ritornello, and these contrasting sections, which consist of flute, harpsichord, and violin. So you hear these 3 instruments playing these in the concertino. But as you go through this, you notice the harpsichord takes a more and more prominent part. Why is this? Well, Bach's playing it. Bach's basically considering that he's going to be playing the harpsichord. So this is Bach basically showing that, yes, I know this is tough to play on the harpsichord, but trust me, I can play it. You want to hear? So in the second part, which just lasts about a minute, the harpsichord gets more and more prominent. And so you hear the harpsichord becoming, more and more prominent during this second part. And then you get to the third part where the harpsichord takes over. And pretty soon there's nothing but harpsichord. And the harpsichord goes on, and it's tough. It really is designed to basically set off Bach's virtuosic abilities. This is how the harpsichord should be played, and so it's a real challenge to people on the harpsichord today. Of course, the harpsichord was basically a lost instrument during the 19th century, and then it was rediscovered and begun to be used again in the 1920s when this Polish pianist named Wanda Landowska discovered it. And she had one built to her specifications, and she began to play the harpsichord again. So people heard the harpsichord again for the first time in the 1920s, and it's been used frequently ever since. And it's often used to harmonize the basso continuo, the bass notes in the figured bass. So, and it's used this way during the first part of the Brandenburg Number 5, the first movement, and then we get towards the end, is all of a sudden he throws the continuo out, and you don't hear a basso continuo, you just hear harpsichord. So this is really an interesting kind of innovation, and it becomes cemented during the next generation with Mozart and Haydn as a cadenza. So this is really a good example of the first cadenza, and it's a monster. Bach also composed these solo instrument suites, dance suites, for violin and for cello. And these dances in the Baroque period involve rhythmic motives. So the bourrée, we're going to hear this rhythmic idea. So that's that rhythm is prominent in this bourrée dance. The saraband is something like dum ba dum bum bum bee ba bee da dee ba dum bum ba ba. So that's and so we get these dances, and they're various dances, the allemand courant, sarabande, gigue, minuet, bourrée. All of these are basically dances that are in these dance suites, and they all involve these rhythmic ideas. So the solo cello dance, the bourrée, is back on page um, 95 of your textbook. So this is just binary forms, just A, A, B, B. And it's monophonic. It just involves this tune. So, yeah, listen to the bourrée and listen to it accompanied by the listening guide. The minuet is another one of these dance suites. In this case, it's by Handel. And so Handel basically was commissioned by King George to write music for his barge. Um, if you go to England, you'll notice that a lot of the palaces, Buckingham Palace, Hampton Roads, Windsor, these palaces, kingly palaces, are all kind of close to the Thames River. So King George was basically floating down the Thames to get from one palace to the next because you don't want to spend too much time in one palace; it gets boring. So why not, get on your barge? Well, the problem with the barge is that it's boring. There's no music going on. So he commissioned Handel to compose these dances, the water music. And the water music, again, is a dance suite. What we have from this is the minuet from the dance suite. And that minuet listening guide is on page, oh, I know where it is, page 100. Nice round number. And it's a minuet is in ternary form. It's ABA. So it's often called a minuet in trio. So you have this minuet in trio. And you notice in this minuet, the A part has the horns. So we hear the horns, kind of, you know, on top of everything, blaring out in that A section. Then the horns cut out for the B section, and we just hear strings. And then the horns come back for the final A section. So you can tell what's going on with this ternary form in the minuet. So the bourrée by Bach is in binary form. The minuet from the water music is in ternary form. Okay. There you see a painting of Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. She was a great musician, renowned for her virtuosic abilities at the keyboard. Usually she played the harpsichord. In French, it's called the clavecin. Um, and, uh, but also she was a fine composer. And she is writing music for King Louis XIV, especially during the late years of his reign as he's getting older, spending more time by himself in his chambers. And this little sonata that she composed was written for the king to enjoy while he ate lunch. The king was accompanied by music at all times. Everywhere he went, these 27 violins went with him. And if he stopped for a minute, the violins would start to play. So he's the only person in all of France who can basically have incidental music. It's not like the mall today where you go and you hear the music piped in. No, there's none of that. No one could afford that except for King Louis, who basically, I don't care if we go bankrupt, I've got to have my violins. So Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre made a living writing music for the king to enjoy. She was a client of King Louis, who was her patron. And that's how composers made a living during this period. So there you see Yo-Yo Ma. I'm not sure he's playing the bourrée that we're going to listen to, but he's certainly capable of doing it. And the bourrée listening guide is on page 95 of your textbook. So take a look at that. The cello suite number 3 includes all kinds of dances, and this bourrée is just one of them. Yo-Yo Ma made his debut at the age of 9. So he's quite a good cellist even when he was 9 years old. And what you find even more interesting is that where the debut took place. It took place at the White House. He played for John F. Kennedy. So, Jacques de la Reyre, as I've said before, was a composer of note who wrote a lot of keyboard music along with, again, dance suites and pieces for harpsichord, some vocal music. And this piece we're going to listen to is called the aria from her 7-movement sonata in D minor. So, so this aria basically it's called a rondeau. So, what is a rondeau? That's the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Um, a rondeau is, as far as Jacques de la Reyre is concerned, a rondeau is just based on a single little tune. And so you hear the tune right at the beginning, and this tune keeps coming back, and this tune keeps coming back in many different ways. So you hear it in D minor, then it repeats in D minor, then you hear it in F major. It's written for violin and continuo. So here the continuo is either a harpsichord or a theorbo and a viola da gamba. So you have these two instruments that play this basso continuo, and then you have the violin on top. You notice at about the viola da gamba plays the theme at 1 minute 14, and then you have a duet between the violin and the viola da gamba. So they both get the little theme. So you'll hear that as you go through this. So this is just a repeating tune, repeats over and over again, sometimes in different keys, and it starts in D minor and it ends in D minor, typical of this period. So it's a beautiful piece, and you see the kind of setting that it might have been played in, although this is not quite as intimate as the King's Lunch. This is for grand entertainment here, this Hall of Mirrors. I mentioned the French and Italian, the French overture earlier. A Passacaglia is just a ground bass in Italian, and a chaconne is a ground bass in French. That's basically what they are. So there are these other instrumental forms that are used in the Baroque period. The instrumental forms are going to change slightly when we get into Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. So just be ready. Some of them continue on. The fugue certainly does in ways, in a number of different ways as we go through.